Before I jump in too much, the big thing here is this is a U.S. government customer. Who here, show of hands, has worked for the U.S. government? Yes, okay, good. I figured that's who would hang. If you haven't, it's different, right? Obviously different from the perspective of things have to move a little bit slower, a little bit more safely, because there's taxpayer dollars at risk, there's lives at risks, depending on whatever you're working on. So it really is a key difference. So today, stepping through this, changing the world a service at a time, kind of sounds catchy. You'll see what it means in a second when we actually step through this. But before we get there, and really need to describe the current state, then we'll talk about the catalyst for change that really drove the government to go where they were going with this. We'll step through the vision they had and how we got to help them with that, and then the realization of that vision. Spoiler alert, this is still ongoing, so this is not something that's completely in the past. We're still actually executing this right now. I was personally involved. This is not just some abstract use case or case study. I was one of the software architects early on, still involved as a lead engineer. Unfortunately, I don't get to just do the software architecture anymore. Have a few more responsibilities, but it's still a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and jump right into the current state. So here is the current enterprise. 3 stove-type systems as an abstract example. You can see each system has an infrastructure of its own. Think literally like hardware or VMs in some cases, networking, everything else. They have their own app framework layer as well with their own applications. And you'll notice that they're actually, laser? No, you get a point. Okay, so apps running on each one. So apps running on each one, all a little bit different, yet all still communicating with the same enterprise. And you see this larger enterprise is out there. So separate infrastructures, separate application frameworks, separate apps themselves, all trying to solve similar but slightly different things. So that's the enterprise. And with that enterprise comes your acquisition and development. Again, if you're used to the government, you know how it works. There's a contract per one, separate government teams per one. That means contracting officer. That means science, engineering, and technology advisors. That means separate contract technical reps. Teams of people there just to support those individual systems. Separate requirements because it's a government contract. You have to have requirements, right? Very extensive, lengthy requirements. Separate development teams because you got separate contracts, separate contractors, and separate development environments. I know you're thinking, okay, you're kind of belaboring the point, right? But you'll see in a second why this drives a lot of the catalyst for change. And honestly, nobody ever sat down and said, you know, it'd be a great idea, let's have 3 separate contracts with all of this overhead, right? It happened organically over time as new things came across. And this was a large-scale change where the government stood back and said, wait, let's really take a look at this again. Let's see how we could change things. Current operations, separate operators for each system, separate manuals delivered for each system because they're all different implementations, separate infrastructure support to make sure you're keeping the IT running and mission capable, and separate install cycles, separate deliveries that have to get coordinated with other people. So, that kind of set the basis. I wanted to get through that quickly. Let's really talk about the catalyst for change. In case you haven't figured it out, shoving all of this on one slide, you see how much waste there is here, right? That is a lot of duplication, and duplication on this scale means it's slow and expensive, right? I mean, that's just a fact of life. If you have this many moving parts, it's going to be slow and expensive. So what was real catalyst for change for the government here? So there's evolving needs, right? Just like for commercial companies, the landscape of the market is always changing. From a U.S. government standpoint, the world is changing, right? I love the best example you hear when you look at wartime efforts. It's not the Cold War anymore, right? We're not sitting here with 2 large nation states. Everything's dynamic now. Everything's different. Same principles apply in the marketplace, right? It's not your large-scale old school companies that run everything anymore. It's those different companies that come in and shake things up and really start new markets. In 1996, we didn't have Google and Android phones and everything else, right? Things change and they move fast. So there's evolving needs even for the mission as well for what the government has to support. Improved security. We've seen all the headlines, right? Security is key now. We can no longer say things like, well, I have this antiquated system that nobody would even think to try to connect to, right? You got to worry about the power grid. You have to worry about all these infrastructure things. You have to worry about government systems in general. You can't just do security by hiding it anymore, right? They know it's there. Your adversaries know it's there. And the threat is always changing. Enabling innovation. So one of the things that wasn't really clear from this is if you were going to be one of those developers, you needed to be very well established. You couldn't have what I always like to call, when we talked about this for years, a 3-person hobby shop that knew one cool specialty thing to do, because the first question will be, well, can you stand up an infrastructure? Can you wire into the entire enterprise? Can you go do all these other things, do the full stack? Because if you can't do the full stack, you can't really come to the table, right? So innovation is getting stifled because they couldn't bring all of those items to bear. Improved capabilities. Now, this one I've talked about for a couple of years as I've worked on this. What's the difference between innovation and improved capabilities? And the answer is an improved capability is something that's already fielded and out there. And you want to give ops the chance to say, let me do a bake-off on this. Let me run that in parallel with what's already in ops, and I want to see what really is better. And I want to be able to provide that feedback. Where innovation, from the perspective I'm coming from, is let's blow it all up and try something completely different. There's nothing for you to even compare against. So obviously, when you get down to software architecture, we're talking about a versioning problem there, right? From being able to improve capabilities, I better be able to support multiple versions of a capability running in parallel in ops so they can do a bake-off. And that's been one of the examples that we've used in the past where ops was able to do comparisons and say, I almost like it enough, you need to go tweak it a little bit more, tweak. Okay, great, that's it. That just became the new operational capability. And we'll just turn the old version off. It's that type of thing that needed to be enabled. Frequent installs and long-term reduced costs, we'll say the bingo word of DevOps, just from a government perspective. So something else to keep in mind. Again, if you've worked with the government, you probably understand this. If you haven't, there is a difference between the acquisition office, the people that buy and pay for the development, versus the people that operate it. So when you say DevOps and you actually have two completely distinct organizations that own the ends of the product, it's different, right? Because the operators and the operations folks are not beholden to me in any way. I'm just the developer. I just show up at the end and then they'll decide if they want to take it. But I don't get to actually run the operational product itself. That's up to somebody else, which is just another challenge. It makes it even more, honestly, interesting. You'll always hear, for software architecture, you have to have soft skills. You have to lead by influence. It's not just the technology. Never is that more the case, except when you run into an environment like this. I don't get to go mandate something by going and convincing a VP. I have to go work with peers and say, hey guys, trust me, let's work this out. Let's figure out how we can get to that place, make you happy, make me happy, and we'll figure out how we can realize all of those changes. So that's the catalyst for change. That's what the government wanted. Here's their vision, and here's what they came in with. And here's where we really teamed with them, and you'll see this teaming and how well it worked. So they came in with this initial vision, right? Here's what they had today, and they're like, that's broke. We've got to get past that. So what do we need to get to? We need to get to a common system. I want a common government-provided infrastructure, commercial model. So I want some sort of infrastructure as a service that people can use. And it will be its own product that gets delivered, and people will utilize that. And then I want a common app framework that's open and modular. I need a domain-specific type of framework that allows people to build these applications that are framework compatible and come in quickly, easily, and cheaply. And that's the key, right? No longer do I have the full stack developer that has to show up. All they need to understand is, how do I use the framework? And I don't even care about the infrastructure. Now let me go do that cool whiz-bang widget that's going to help improve something about the mission. So that's the key. That was their vision. So they roll in with a very high-level vision. That's what I want. But they did much better than that. This is a very mature government folks we worked with. They brought in a reference architecture, what we affectionately refer to as the chiclet chart. So they came in with component-level architecture saying, I believe we have functions And who's familiar with DoDAF? DoDAF views, anyone? Okay, yeah, I know. The defense contractors are. So the views in general are what's the functionality I need to worry about, so more of a SV4. And then they had logical components saying, I'm going to decompose this complicated problem into logical chunks. And then I'll say there's certain functions that need to go with those logical chunks. That's basically it, and that's what they rolled in with. And they rolled in with that from a customer perspective, from a government perspective, not a software architecture perspective. And that's a key thing. They're talking in terms of mission. They're not talking in terms of technology, of RESTful APIs, or anything like that. They're saying this part here is a data manager. Here's the type of data I need it to manage. I need it to do this. These weren't even requirements. This was just them talking architecturally, but keeping it abstract from the implementation. So they lay this out, and they come, and we have a kickoff with the different developer folks, and they throw this up on the screen, and they talk through it with us. And it was a really good conversation, very, very open with us. And I'm like, great, okay, so I get that, and then 2 weeks later, I come back, and we have a different sit-down with them because I started asking some very pointed questions right off the bat. I said, great, you showed a component. I don't see anything that says user interface up there at all. So where do the human beings actually look at data? And there was a little bit of silence. They said, dang, that's a good question. And I was like, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, there's operators for these systems. They need to see something. They need to be able to do something. And it wasn't oversight on their part. That's not what they were expecting to accomplish before they handed it off to the developers. They wanted to say, this is the mission focus. You guys are smart. I want you to roll with it from here. I'm giving you my vision. I'm giving you that next step. So I went off for a couple weeks, and I started using software architecture tools. I said, hey, let me lay out a domain model first, right? Because we're talking different terms now. What is the definition of a system anymore when you have the system that you saw earlier broken up as infrastructure as a service, platform, and framework, and applications? What does system even mean anymore? Does it mean anything? Yes, no, well, what's it composed of? What is an app? What does an app do? Are apps able to talk to externals in the enterprise, or are apps supposed to just stick on the framework? And I started cranking through different domain model views. I laid out just very simple Excel spreadsheets to say, let's literally write 2 sentences for each one of those components, because we just need to define that, and let me repeat it back to you in the way I understand it. And am I getting it right or not? Laying out very high-level actors, defining actors, right? Here are the actors that are going to interact with that system. Framework developers, application developers, operators. There's different types of operators. How would they interact with each one of those couple of sentences for a component? Very high-level stuff. Very simple tools. I've heard it mentioned in some of the other talks. I am not a UML zealot. I like to use fit-for-purpose views enough to communicate with other human beings and make sure we're on the same page. I never like to get too nuanced of, we'll see the arrow had like a filled-in triangle versus a clear triangle, so clearly you should have understood. No, I'm talking to the government. I'm not talking to fellow software people. So very fit-for-purpose views. And we laid out a few sequence diagrams too, right? I wanted to see a runtime view. Show me a runtime view of where are those responsibilities at? Who's responsible for making this decision or that decision, and who interacts with the users? So then, this is where I actually took all that SEI training and applied it. And we did a modified quality attribute workshop. This was fantastic. Who here has ever done a quality attribute workshop? SEI and me and a couple of the Lockheed folks. Okay, so do you know what a quality attribute workshop is? Yes, okay, good, yes, good. So it's one of those things that you learn about and you're like, man, who's ever gonna pay me to do that, right? Because my schedules won't support it, things like that. It's a great tool, and for us, it was perfect timing, because 4 weeks after we had that sit down with the gorier details of, I think I've modeled some stuff, am I even in the zone? I haven't talked about any non-functionals. I haven't talked about any quality attributes. All we've been talking about is, did I logically understand what you were trying to tell me? So we actually bring in some of our Raytheon architects, like people completely independent of our team, to help facilitate the meeting, bring in lots of different government folks, and it was fantastic. We bring up the reference architecture, we bring up some of the definitions, get a whiteboard, and we start talking. We're like, all right, here's your sticky notes. You tell me what your largest goals are, and what are those attributes you care about the most. We crank through that for about 4 hours. And it is fantastic because everybody's coming with different opinions, because guess what? The government, just like every other team in the world, is not all on the same page. They don't have one opinion. There's varying levels of responsibility on how much does an app do versus how much should a framework do, and what's the right answer, and is there always one right answer? And that really drives a lot of these quality attributes, right? And it brings lots of different perspectives, which is important because you want to hear all of those voices. You want to understand, hey, 9 out of 10 people were saying this was important, but what was that one person saying and why? And is that something that the rest of us are just missing? And so we actually got to sit in the room and hear all of that conversation. And that's incredibly important because basically some of the folks were like, no, you're missing a point because sometimes there's cases like this. And then others are saying, no, but that's like a 20% of the time that'll happen and 80% of the time it won't. And that's why it should be prioritized lower. And at some point, I just sat down and listened. I didn't need to do anything else. I was just absorbing it. And I think this is the type of soft skill stuff that we talk about a lot in these software architecture classes, where you truly just need to facilitate and understand. And then we actually started describing the scenarios. And it was, what are the scenarios that we try to run through to prove out these prioritized quality attributes? And we had some hits and misses in that. This was our first time working this type of workshop with these folks, but it was fantastic, and we were able to talk through it. And the scenarios really helped us drive home a better understanding. I don't know about you, independent of whoever your customer is, heck, even internally, you could all sit in a room, talk for 6 hours, agree, walk out, and have completely different understandings of what you just agreed to, right? I mean, has anybody else seen this? It happens. And where you really see if you're on the same page is when you start stepping through a scenario and you're like, all right, step one, this happens. And then that's like the first step. Everybody throws their hands up in the air and they're like, no, that's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to do this. Well, no, we said these words. Yeah, I interpreted it this way. Well, that's important when you're talking to your customer, right? I want to make sure I'm on the same page with them. So this was fantastic. The goals that we rung out were, you need to get time to market fast. It's got to be fast. Want to make it where the app developers do not have to understand the full stack. We've got to enable that cheap, reliable delivery all the way to operations. So got to get there. All right, so now the realization. We're all on the same page with the vision, relatively speaking. We're close enough. So now we start to pivot. How are we going to really make it happen? Well, first thing was contractually. You can see, showing kind of abstractly, 5 different contracts popped out in the end. So you're probably sitting there thinking, well, didn't you just have 3 before? Well, yes, but they were all probably about the same size. These are going to be much smaller, right? Some of these are going to eliminate the size for many of the other ones. So you had the commercial model type of, here's infrastructure as a service. You had your open modular application framework, and then you had your very specific contracts for each app. Well, that's going to be much smaller compared to the full stack contracts. And you'll see in a second why that will matter. All right, then we get into the technical, and here is where I think the government did a fantastic job, and we've learned a lot of lessons over the years as a team on this. First off was application developer focused. So a contract deliverable was defined for the framework, which I'm involved with, that says you're not just building a framework, you're building an SDK that's going to have APIs, it's going to have libraries, it's going to have examples, you're going to have simulators. You will deliver that, and I expect to see it. Historically, we'd done similar things like this, but it was never a contract deliverable to say, and provide an SDK, and make it developer focused, right? That's a big change. That's a very important change, especially when you're talking government contracting. And it just showed the commitment and the level of maturity they were bringing to the table. Use those commercial cloud services. Bluntly, I paid for it, so you better be using it, right? I don't want to see you inventing your own or building up your own just because you could, right? We're trying to provide you these capabilities. I want to actively see you using it. You need to explain that to me if you're not using it, which makes a lot of sense. DevOps, all right, there's your bingo card, right? So play it, DevOps in a government model. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting. Remember that common system we saw before was 3 different layers, right? The infrastructure as a service, the framework itself, and then the apps. So the question is, DevOps, we generally talk about a product I'm delivering to ops or a system, or if all you deliver are services, then services. But in this model, I have to make sure a system is functioning for the larger enterprise. So how does DevOps work if I have 4 different contracts and you need to deliver one system? And by the way, they're not subcontracts. They're peers. So that's a challenge. That's a big challenge. Now, from our standpoint, we have a DevOps pipeline for the framework. And at some point, apps inject what needs to be delivered, but how they built, how they deployed, how they tested, completely independent. Sounds a little weird, I know, but think about it. When you think Agile and you think DevOps, you think my team knows how to use the tools and knows what works for my culture. And how do I come in with some sort of draconian definition of there is only one way to do DevOps, and your team and your culture has to adapt to my definition? That's ridiculous, right? That is the most anti-DevOps focused thing from a framework guy's perspective. I never want to make an app developer have to fit my paradigm for how they code. Now, I do have to at some point say, but you have to deliver, and it has to meet certain criteria, certain minimal things. There's security-based things, there's business rule type things that the government's defined that you have to do. And we do serve somewhat as the gatekeeper of that to say, hey guys, here's what you got to do as a minimal. I'm not going to be overly prescriptive, but you got to focus on this stuff. So that's a really interesting challenge, and it's a lot of fun to work through with these guys. And then finally, microservices, there's your other bingo card. So from our standpoint, microservices to apps, I don't want the apps to ever know I have microservices. What I'm trying to do is have more of a higher level facade type of service that I would expose to them. And then behind that, I'll have microservices where I could rapidly change implementation without impacting the direct API that's app focused. And that's key, right? Because again, you saw those were separate contracts. How would you feel if every 3 months I said, oh, by the way, I made a non-backwards compatible change. Sorry. Hope you have enough budget to go rework that. Hope that fits your schedule. Well, we have got to be sensitive to that, right? We've got to know that if I wouldn't want that to happen, then I know they sure as heck wouldn't want it to happen. So we have to be very mindful of that. And again, it's the type of thing that the government had already been thinking through. Now, they didn't prescribe microservices. They didn't prescribe the term DevOps. They prescribed all the quality attributes they wanted to wring out of it. And this is part of that realization from a technical standpoint. Now, organizationally, some other changes and challenges we made. Application support teams. So it's not just about the technology. You have to have human beings talking to human beings. They have got to understand, this is what I really mean when I say the framework will do this, and have that two-way conversation of the app developer saying, yeah, but I need that. And you're like, oh, okay, well, you know what? Maybe we are just a little bit off, and let's go back to the ranch and see if we can do something with that. Basically, solution architects is what I'm kind of talking about. Solution architects to on-ramp the developers, help desk capabilities, coordinating schedule needs, and defining SLAs with the apps. Application providers, they have to provide their needs to the framework. They also have to maximize their utilization, and they have to satisfy those SLAs. Some of those SLAs are examples of those business rules we talked about. I won't force them to call a service, but I'm going to tell them that everybody expects that they're calling a service, things like that. And then finally, the government serves as the system integrator. They have to make sure it all comes together. We run some tests, and we provide them evidence to say we believe things are hanging together, but ultimately it's your call. And we provide that data to them so that they can make educated decisions. All right, now let's talk social. Now it's really getting warm and fuzzy, right? So here's a reality. Framework developers, we aren't building the system anymore. And we're talking about ingrained cultures for all the different developers that had been building these stovepipe systems for years. It's gone. You're not doing that anymore. It's just different. So now you have to think in terms of, I need to think about the system, but I don't deliver the system. Don't lose the big picture, but realize that you cannot force other people to do everything the way that you would have historically done it. There will be different ways that app developers would want to solve a problem, and you better be prepared to understand it and figure out if we can make that work. Now, it's a balancing act because it's obviously limited scope for everybody, but you just can't roll in and say, but I've done it this way for 20 years, so why would I do it any different now? Right? It's different. Making SDKs public. How many of you actually publish, like on the internet, your APIs? Now, I know IBM probably does, so I mean, I hear you on that. But a lot of you, if it's your own internal projects, nobody really documents that low level unless they were actually asked to do it. So guess what's probably going to be challenging? Writing documentation and samples good enough for other people to pick it up. I'm not just talking Java docs, right? I'm talking like real examples with simulators. It's a challenge. As people on-ramp to this program, we have an overview. And one of the things I stress to them is the saying, you will eat your own dog food. And by that, I mean you better not be building in backdoors because you don't like an API. If you don't like the API as a software developer, what do you think an app developer, software developer is going to think? They're going to hate it. If you don't like it, change it. Work with somebody. I mean, obviously controlled change, but still, raise your hand and say, hey, I think this is broken and here's why. Have that open communication, but do not bypass the APIs and say, I'm not going to worry about it. So you got to eat your own dog food and be very careful of those microservices. I know we've heard a lot about it in some of the different talks, and I think we've seen the perils of microservices where you can go crazy, and all of a sudden you have 1,000 microservices all trying to orchestrate, and it turns into debug hell, right? So it's that balancing act. Be very careful. Now, for the app developers, it's the same thing. They're not building the system anymore. They have to figure out, how do I do that orange app box and communicate to the framework and not say, yeah, I'm using the framework, but I built my own system over here. It's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. And this is a social thing because you know what? We're all smart engineers and nobody wants to stop thinking how they've been thinking for years. You're used to solving a certain problem and now somebody's telling you solve a different problem. And that's a change. And it's exciting change though because it's going to be cool the types of things we get to do in this area now because this customer leaned forward so much. So that's the social change. Now let's kind of look at a summary here. So where are we at? So successes so far, that quality attribute workshop and that early architecture analysis, that really laid a solid foundation for us to start building up a lot of things, a lot of con-ops, different app engagement TIMs that we've had to talk with folks, and utilization of those commercial cloud services. Some rapid prototyping to say, will it work? Do I like this? Do I not like this? How do I prevent vendor lock-in? How am I careful on how I utilize those services and expose them? Do I let it bleed through my APIs? Obviously, you want to have goodness there, not bleed through too much, but then it's a balancing act because you don't want to say, well, I made my own. So facade pattern, light where possible. Those were successes. Now, here's the reality of the challenges. And like I said, this is still ongoing. There are overlapping schedules. Read that as we're building in parallel. So simulators are key, right? Schedule constraints are key. Someone as an app is trying to build something while I'm still trying to define parts of the framework. We're on different types of development approaches. Some are capital A Agile, some are lowercase a Agile, right? We want to use Agile principles, but a release might be like every 4 months or so because you just need more than just Jello, right? You need something a little bit more stable. Others are like, hey man, every 2 weeks I'm cranking it out. So how does that work, right? Separate contractors, separate entities, can't make everybody be on the same development schedule. So it's one of those challenges. And again, it's sitting down and just having the conversations and working through it with them and say, hey, we're all really smart people. How are we going to do this? And it's been working well. And then finally, evolving technology insertion, process, and timelines. Boy, that's a mouthful. But what that really means is, as they come up to speed on that infrastructure as a service, new capabilities are getting added along the way, but they might not be there yet. So it's that, standard issue of, hey, in 6 months, I could do this. Unfortunately, I need to build it today. So I've got to make some choices today and then deal with the consequences of it coming later. Or do I put all my chips on red and go and say, yes, I assume they're going to make that schedule and they'll be there. Fingers crossed it shows up. And what do I do in the meantime until it's actually there? How do I simulate it? So it's those types of capabilities and challenges that are out there. In the same breath, this is tons of fun. I have thoroughly enjoyed this from a software architecture perspective. I am definitely the type of person that likes to focus on interacting with people, understanding the problem and working through it. And by definition, you have to actually do that in a paradigm like this. So it's really cool seeing the US government finally catch up to where commercial's been for years. But obviously with the different constraints, that's what slows it down. And it's been great working with them as a team and with the other contractors. So that was my last slide. Thank you for your time.
So we have 3 minutes left. Time for questions for Gerry. If anybody would like to ask.
Yeah. So in the new implementation with multiple contractors, are you delivering to one common integration facility, or are you delivering to each other and everybody maintains their own? How does that work?
There are common environments where the integration can happen. So yeah, we'll eventually get to common integration areas. We're actually working through some details right now of how could you get early snaps in different areas, but not at key integration points, more as risk mitigation. So.
Very good. Interesting talk about government as an integrator and
Yes.
architecture practices and culture change. Very nice. Yes.
So you were talking about the quality attribute workshop, right? And we're trying to get a broad variety of interests and stakeholders represented. So who did you have at your quality attribute workshop?
So we had a variety of different government folks from the acquisition office, some of their senior architects as well, and some of their different SETAs, the Science, Engineering, Technology Assistants, and we had a couple of FFRDC folks. Nobody from SEI, but we did have a couple of those in as well. If you're not familiar with FFRDCs, basically what they can do is they serve as think of make sure I'm not insulting my SEI brethren. So it is a separate entity, a third party that can weigh in on the goodness of the technical approach you're taking, but they have absolutely no dog in the game, right? They're not one of the contractors. They aren't directly reporting to any of the acquisition folks. They're just giving them a summary report of, I think this is the right type of thing, or I think you could improve here. And they kind of give you that third party view of what's going on, so.
Because you said, you gave the example of A, B, and C, old system contracts. Did you have representation from each of those?
Yes, we did.
And some of the operator community and things like that?
We eventually went to the operator community. I think initially it was, let's get the development side on the same page first, as much as we could. And then we went out and started having conversations with the operation folks as well, once we had settled at least on a gelatin foundation for where we were going, so. Yeah.
Did you draw from or consider using anything like Scaled Agile framework?
It was something that we looked at, and we are using some principles from Scaled Agile framework, but not vectoring directly to it. Oh, question?
Do the different contracts have different compliance requirements? Does that change the architecture?
What do you mean by compliance requirements?
Well, so I have to deal with SOC 2, occasionally SOX compliance, and I'm going down to compliance, security compliance for privacy and things like that. So different contracts, so they may have different organizations, but also the government.
Gotcha. Nothing that drastically different from a operations type of compliance standpoint. The framework would take care of a lot of the compliance for them. That was one of the benefits. So we did have to work with those folks to say, here's the compliance we resolve for you. There's still some compliance you just have to do yourself and prove it. So that kind of compliance was still there. Execution compliance was different depending on some of the contracts. So that did get into some of the process changes, but.
The framework's a good answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. Thank you, Gerry.